We wanted to believe. We wanted to call out. On August 20th and September 5th, 1977, two spacecraft were launched from the Kennedy Space Flight Center, Florida. They were called Voyager. Each one carries a message.
This is a DNA colonization from deep space.
A gold-plated record depicting images, music, and sounds of our planet, arranged so that they may be understood if ever intercepted by a technologically mature extraterrestrial civilization.
I can show you the evidence that you're not alone. And I'm going to tell you this tonight. There has been an unprecedented pickup of objects in the sky. They have been moving here, but they have been seen also over Europe and over the Carpathians and down into the areas around Yugoslavia.
13 years after its launch, Voyager 1 passed the orbital plane of Neptune and essentially left our solar system. Within that time, there were no further messages sent, nor are any planned. We wanted to listen. On October 12, 1992, NASA initiated the High-Resolution Microwave Survey, a decade-long search by radio telescopes scanning 10 million frequencies for any transmission by extraterrestrial intelligence. Less than 1 year later, first-term Nevada Senator Richard Bryan successfully championed an amendment which terminated the project. I wanted to believe, but the tools have been taken away. The F-Files have been shut down. They closed our eyes. Our voices have been silenced. Our ears now deaf to the realms of extreme possibilities. To the Empire Never Ended. This is Boris and Fritz and Ray.
Man, when Boris is introducing the show, you know you're in for something.
Yeah. I'm excited actually because I kind of don't know what to expect. I know that we're going to be doing aliens. I know Wesley Swift is involved, which is always funny.
How do you know that?
The Wesley Swift bot that you've put in our chat.
Yeah, he's live here with us today.
So, I guess we're taking a little bit of a departure in that we haven't really done anything that wasn't rooted in planet Earth. So we did have some stuff, right? Especially in the Silver Shirts episode. We've had interdimensional beings.
Yeah. Mason too, a little bit.
A little bit, but we've never really gone head on into this territory.
I'd even describe it as kind of like banging your head against this territory. That's sort of more how this felt to make. Yeah,
I like banging my head against the wall.
So, Fritz, when you got into this material, you kind of figure out that this is not one episode, right? So occasionally we'll have an F-Files episode. This is an idea, right?
I think this is probably going to be a long-running series. I think you're going to see F-Files scattered throughout the next few arcs, possibly indefinitely. I mean, aliens and Nazis, they go way back, and we're not even getting into like the really crazy shit. This is scratching the surface, but I think you're gonna enjoy it.
I wonder if someone of us made the thing with the duct tape on the window and the lamp, who would appear? Like,
ooh, good question. Yeah.
Who would be the Deep Throat character?
Yeah, who would be our Deep Throat?
That's a good question.
Oh, you know what? I don't know. Probably one of our favorite Patreon listeners, honestly.
Yeah, he's kind of our.
We got a deep throat. Big love, by the way. Big love to our Deep Throat.
Big ups.
Yeah. So we got two today.
F-File number 01, the Kelly-Hopkinsville Encounter, 1955.
The first one is the Kelly Goblins. So basically the story is this. In 1955, with our ship, let's just say that we're the Goblins, with our ship that is squirting rainbows across the sky as we travel, a la E.T., we land just outside the Sutton Tobacco Farm, the group of us in our spaceship. And let's say we send Boris out to go and communicate with these Kentuckians. So he walks out with his weird long silver monkey arms raised in a plaintive gesture, hands up, don't shoot kind of style. And he slowly approaches a couple of carnies named Lucky and J.C. Sutton as they step out of this tobacco farmhouse that they lived in. So Lucky and J.C. obviously shoot at Boris, and Boris runs off into the woods. All right. So this is the initial statement of a woman named Glennie Mae Lankford, who is the owner of the farm that we're talking about. And at this time, she's the 50-year-old matriarch of this house. So a radio broadcast at 8 a.m. the next morning told the story of this close encounter at Kelly Station in Christian County, Kentucky, just outside Hopkinsville. And an Air Force major named John E. Albert hears the story on the radio on his first day on his way to Campbell Air Base, calls up his superiors there, asks them if they checked out her story. The base doesn't seem that interested, but tells him to go knock himself out. So he goes there, he takes a statement from Glennie and makes some of his own notes, including them in his report, and concluding that essentially he thinks that these carnies / tobacco farmers freaked themselves out about an escaped circus monkey or something, and that's that. It's not a great explanation. I mean, it requires a circus monkey, which isn't a great start. So he thinks that that's going to be that. But it's not, right? The Lankford home quickly becomes a hotspot for UFO curious people, and more researchers come who are then being charged the equivalent today of $5 to walk around the property, $10 to ask a question to the Lankfords, and $100 per photo that you want to take. So the most important visitor that they had, though, was a woman named Isabel Davis from the Center of UFO Studies, which was a more or less respected civilian outfit out of New York. So she gets there about 10 months later, and in that time, the story had grown a lot. So the Lankfords at this point, in Isabel Davis's account, were straight up under attack by multiple silver goblin-like creatures who were, in some accounts, floating barely above the ground. Each bullet that these the carnies are shooting at these guys, and each bullet that hits one of these aliens bounces off of them, making a sound like clanging metal. And each time it hits them, they do a little flip and disappear into the woods. And it happens just over and over and over again. They come up to the windows. One of them climbs up on the roof and runs his claw hand through the hair of either JC or Lucky, And so illustrations that were made shortly after this show this kind of very goblin-like looking guy, diminutive, super long arms, super short legs, eyes kind of set to the side of its head. Either in some accounts the eyes glowed, in other accounts the skin glowed, and of course these long claws dangling from these chimp-like arms of theirs. And very fantastic tale. And then that very same night, the very next night rather, they returned to terrorize the tobacco farmers even more. Right. This account from Isabel Davis also includes statements from the chief of police, who claims that the Lankfords basically busted into the police station at around midnight. Now, for some reason, the chief of police is there at midnight, I guess, working late on all the tough murder cases in rural Hopkinsville or whatever. And while he couldn't confirm their story and found no evidence to support it, he didn't doubt that the terror in their face, And this is kind of what he would tell people moving forward, that yes, they showed up. Yes, they were terrified. No, we didn't find any evidence, but anybody who saw their faces would believe them. So the Davis account is widely considered the authoritative, even to this day, the authoritative report on this incident. It's a very well done account. It's very organized. It includes counter narratives, with comment about the counter narratives. And the narrative that Isabel Davis hates the most is that of Major John Albert, who we mentioned a second ago, the first guy who showed up on the scene. So she frames Albert's account of this as dismissive and classist, and he's just kind of a dick. So she explains that Glennie Langford's initial statement that Albert took, like there's a statement signed by Glennie, either that statement is a forgery or that Albert was like forcing her to write something that he wanted. So essentially, like, for Albert's story to be true, this would have to mean two things that Isabel Davis is completely unwilling to concede. So the first one, that this family of tobacco farmers and carnies were engaging in some kind of a hustle. I mean, imagine carnies hustling you. You know what I mean? Never happened. And also to have like a larger conspiracy that has to include the chief of police himself. Furthermore, Isabel calls out John Albert on this dismissive attitude towards Miss Langford's religiosity. She's a religious person, you know. So she sees Albert as being like, she's in some crazy holy roller church. Like, they got all excited the night before from a service they went to, and then they just freaked out when they got home. So Isabel assures us that Mrs. Langford is only moderately religious, and she attends a Pentecostal church, which Isabel describes as holding conventional services, against Albert's claim that she went to a holy roller church whose services are charismatic and exciting and blah, blah, blah. We'll talk about that a lot in a second. So okay. And also, like, Albert was there for a couple of hours or something, whereas Isabel spent like a lot of time with the Suttons and Mrs. Langford. And yeah, sure. It is entirely possible that Albert is an asshole, kind of a classist dude. He's an Air Force guy, you know, who didn't think much of Mrs. Langford and dismissed her as like another irrational hillbilly. Very possible. But also, like, Pentecostal churches absolutely had the holy roller thing going on at the time. I mean, I don't know if hers did or not, but absolutely, yeah. I mean, very much part of that scene. But it's possible that hers wasn't. It's possible. But here's the big kicker, though. And this is what makes me believe Albert's story as essentially factual. I don't think his monkey thing is necessarily correct, but okay. But Major Albert, when he was there, noticed a religious tract, like a pamphlet, at the Langford farm that Glennie explained that she had heard about on the radio and sent off from Fort Worth, Texas. The creator of this tract was Kingdom Publishers, and the author was a guy named Lovell. He doesn't say anything about this except for that. Just says there was this tract, author was this guy named Lovell, publisher was Kingdom Publishers in Fort Worth, Texas, and what was remarkable about it for him was that on this tract was a small picture of a monkey that was painted silver. Yeah? That's what he said. So this is why he thought, okay, they just conflated a couple of events, and then the silver monkey that they saw came out in their story. But now Isabel claims that he made this up, you know, but who is Lovell? Lovell exists. His name is John A. Lovell. He was a leading proponent in Texas of a little thing called British Israelism. But which is funny because Pentecostalism is a large thing with many points of origin. One of those points of origin is a British Israelite named Charles Parham. So it's not a strong link, right? It's just this is still the realm of like coincidence in history. Okay, but what would it mean to be a British Israelite in Texas in the 50s? At that point, you're actually talking about what we're going to start calling Christian identity shortly after, right? This is around the time that Wesley Swift and, what's his name? William Potter Gale sort of put the nail in the coffin on traditional British Israelism, and it moved irrevocably towards Christian identity, which was like, if you guys recall, from earlier episodes, the ultra-racist, like apocalyptic fascist cult that we've talked a lot about. Richard Butler of Aryan Nations eventually became the leader of it. So listeners hopefully are familiar with that. If not, we have a bunch of episodes on it. So if Isabel is correct and this Albert guy made up that detail, that would mean that like this supposedly, according to her, a kind of a straight-laced kind of upper-class dude knew a lot about what was essentially the latest in like underground fascist cults, essentially, and knew enough about it to make up an existing author and an existing publisher, which is part of like the brand new like Christian identity movement, you know, which I find very unlikely. So let's look for a minute before we get back to the Langfords at Wesley Swift. And we talked about him in previous episodes, of course, quite a lot, but this time we need to really focus on the UFO angle of Wesley Swift and the aliens. So we need to take a journey back, I guess, to, I think it was episode 55. Swift and Gale, Christian Identity Rangers. Yeah. So Swift, who, by the way, is still honored by Christian identists today. Like I said, he completed that shift from the classical British Israelism to full-on Christian identity, taking, like, for instance, the idea that Anglos were the lost tribe of Judah, to the point when they are essentially the only tribes of Judah, and all the tribes of Judah are some kind of like white culture, and that Jews are not at all Israelis, but are in fact the demon spawn of Satan himself, and are an entirely different species from white folk.
Right.
So Swift took that even farther, as so did Gale, by the way. As I'm sure you'll remember, and he started to weave ufology into this general religious outlook following Roswell, and it became part of his like dual seed line thesis, eventually coming to a point where all the races of Earth were in fact the descendants of refugees from an intergalactic battle between a space Satan and a fleet of black people against Aryan aliens over Earth, where they all crashed and settled.
Right.
They turn and wheel and move and travel at great velocities. Whole fleets of them move together. Singularly also they move. So again, we cite to you that in the universe roundabout and in the world roundabout, we are not alone. We should have never for a moment thought we were anyhow, because if we turned over to the 12th chapter of the book of Revelation, we have the historical account which Jesus unveils to John and is recorded in the book of Revelation of a great space battle in which Michael the Archangel was the victor over Lucifer, who was rebellious over against the throne of God.
That's sort of...
So it's that kind of Scientology ripoff there, too.
Yeah,
back when we talked about that, yeah.
So it's very much like Swift in the 50s. Christian Identity in the 50s and 60s had this character. In the 50s, Swift was in like full fucking swing. Aliens and religion were mixing into this like hot swamp of stupid and claiming things like Venus arrived in the solar system 4,000 years ago, causing earthquakes, which made the aliens visit, and that Satan is like an alien crossbreed between a lizard. Oh, a lizard and what, if you remember?
Jew? I don't know.
Well, no. He was a cross between like a lizard and an ape. He was like
okay.
Yeah. But I got some other like gems straight from the horse's mouth that I wanted to share just to get a sense of this guy and also this time in history for Christian identity. So these clips are all from the same sermon delivered about a year after the Kelly encounter. They don't relate to the Kelly encounter directly, but I think it's important just to hear like what was going on in essentially a 2-decade span there of Christian identity.
There are certain craters right now on the face of the moon that have had cities built within them, that have had landing fields and airstrips and all kinds of development. There exists in one crater of the moon now what looks like a tremendous hangar that's illuminated and can be seen even in the dark of the moon. Its size almost as wide as a city block, back down in a deep, almost box canyon in one of the craters of the mountains of the moon.
Here is a very interesting take on the send the black people back to Africa thing.
The book of Enoch that helps to throw light, along with ancient Sumerian history, on the coming of the Negroes who were brought out of a spot in the Milky Way as a part of the rebellious warriors on the crafts of Lucifer. And when they were first introduced in Earth, they were not a part of Earth or its creation, but in the violations of divine law, mongolization, integration, and mutation which satanic power sought to induce, they were brought to Earth and they became more brutish because they degenerated from their original status.
Interesting take. So there'll be no Negroes on the Earth, he says. Doesn't mean extermination, means going back to their home planet where they'll be happy.
Which is what?
I don't know. Actually, I don't know if he specified. I'm sure he did, though. Wesley Swift always knew everything, you know. All right. So that's just what was going on in the Christian identity scene. That's the kind of stuff you would see if you ordered sermons, let's say, what you could do. Wesley Swift offered these sermons for order, and just, you know, sense of what's going on there at the time. So interestingly, Swift relies a lot on the Book of Enoch, which is part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and as far as I know, is only canon in Christian identity, and Coptics, Ethiopian, Egyptian Coptics, yes. Yeah, but this is all like very weak as far as like establishing Langford as like a Christian identitarian or whatever you call them. It's not, we don't know, and we can't know, and we won't know for certain that her church was Christian identity. And maybe Isabel is right about Albert, for whatever reason, wanting to delegitimize Langford's story. And so as I was reading this, you know, I definitely needed a lot more. So I tried to establish some criteria. for what it would take to like tip over enough, to say with some confidence that it's a likely explanation for this event. So so I went ahead and I got to know Lucky Sutton's daughter, Geraldine Stith, who is basically a normal Kentucky woman with this is all today, this is current, with a very sweet kind of Southern demeanor and a very slowly growing list of books and appearances and films that either she was featured in or she herself has made. And her main book is called Alien Legacy, and she was nice enough to dramatize it in a film she made called The Invasion of Kelly in 2017. And it's a very amateurish film. It sort of rides the line between like just real cringe and also like kind of funny B-movie, like unintentional humor. But, I can't shit on it too much. She's not a filmmaker, she's like a regular person.
She made a film. She's a filmmaker.
She made it. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, that's right. I mean, like, and there's actually a couple of like really good scenes in it, in what otherwise is a very horrible film. And also you get to see Lucky Sutton Jr. In it. Playing his dad, and he is like real as fuck. I mean, he's just this like, he's great. I mean, he's like the spirit of Western Kentucky. He's got like fucking tattoos on his knuckles that say Lucky and shit. He's fantastic. So anyway, Geraldine's account varies in some ways from the official one, but I think the variation is due to keeping like the narrative really tight, which since none of this ever happened, you might as well do, no shade there. But she does reveal some very interesting elements that weren't part of the Isabel Davis story at all. For one, she strongly suggests that the first time she actually heard this story was when she was an adolescent, right? This happened when she was 8 years old, the event, the attack of the Goblins. But she says in this film that the first time she heard the story was when she was an adolescent or a young teen, when these two weirdos approached her dad, Lucky, and he told them the tale in front of her. Secondly, she does confirm that her grandma Glennie was indeed seriously religious and that she took the children to church on the regular. But the most interesting thing for me was this very bizarre scene, which seemed to come out of absolutely nowhere, which shows like Geraldine Langford, the matriarch of the farm, sitting around a fire with a black family, discussing the recent loss of the mother of this family, who apparently lived with the Suttons and worked for them until her death. Geraldine in the film goes way out of her way to present Glennie as like the benevolent white boss, with these like kind of very grateful children of her, housemaid, like thanking her profusely for being a kind, I'm trying not to use the word master, but I mean, we'll get to that in a second, but a very kind boss, etc. And at some point, the black family, for no reason at all, breaks out into an a cappella version of Wade in the Water. I guess just because, it's the perfect image of like the grateful, happy, like simple black person that is presented in this film. And for no reason at all. They were never part of the story in any way. It's just to show, I think, that Geraldine Langford is like not racist, which I never even heard before. So, it got me thinking that, Major Albert says when he gets there that the Langford house is like quite poor. 10 months later, after this has become like a thing and people start paying money to come and see them and they start getting appearances and blah, 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 Isabel Davis has them successfully paying off their mortgage, running a tractor and stuff like this. And in Geraldine's telling, this woman that worked for Glennie Langford died like just before these aliens showed up. And also, the aliens showed up shortly after Glennie's husband left the farm. So, I mean, there is, it's good motive for a hoax. Okay, but, we can't tell if that happened or not like that. So I'm interested more in this like CI angle, the Christian identity angle. So the scene in general got me wondering about race relations in that part of Kentucky at the time. And my thinking was that, for example, if there was like a lot of Klan activity around there, it could be fair to assume that Glennie's Pentecostal church would have at least had some contact with Wesley Swift's ideas, since thanks to Gerald L.K. Smith, that we talked about a lot on this arc, the Nazi middleman, this kind of British Israelism, Christian identity thing crept into reconstituted Klan organizations throughout the 50s and 60s. So Hopkinsville, which is the town to which Kelly Station is connected, is notable also for something called the Black Tobacco Wars in the first, the teens and early 20s in this area, the Hopkinsville, Kelly area. So, and all over Kentucky, actually. Well, Western Kentucky, anyway. So, what happened was essentially tobacco farmers of the Hopkinsville area banded together and did like a terror campaign against these larger tobacco firms that were purchasing from them in order to convince these firms to like give them more money when they purchased their tobacco. These terrorists at the time were called the Night Riders, and they existed in like the last part of the 1910s and the very early 1920s. Now, on their Wikipedia, you get this line that says something like, don't confuse this group with the Ku Klux Klan. This is very, very bad advice. So the Hopkinsville tobacco farmers, according to like the legitimate historian George C. Wright, and this book he wrote called Racial Violence in Kentucky, 1865 to 1940, which University of Illinois printed, these guys were absolutely lynching the fucking shit out of people at like the height of the Second Klan. And Wright has no qualms whatsoever about conflating like the Night Riders of the Black Tobacco Wars and the Klan. These motherfuckers like rode around on horseback in the middle of the night with like black hoods and robes, waving torches around, going house to house, pulling black people out of their homes and like lynching them on the regular. So yeah, they were also fucking with the tobacco firms. That's true. But I'm going to make just a wild guess here, just putting it out there. My guess is that they didn't really see the owners of these tobacco firms as entirely white either, if you get my meaning. But who knows? But so the tobacco farmers in that very relatively small area of the Sutton tobacco farms were all hooded up in 1920 when Glennie Langford was a fully married adult working on a tobacco farm or owning a tobacco farm. These tobacco farms were almost exclusively slave-run until the end of the Civil War, and these farmers, like the Langfords, represent a dispossessed slave-owning class. And the fact that Glennie kept a woman in her home, of course, no way implies that she was not a racist at all, obviously. You know, I mean, this is just what happened to these post-Reconstruction farms. So this event happened in 55, though, not in the 1920s. So there was this thing, guys, called the Third Klan that picked up in the 1950s, including in Kentucky. And by the early 60s, Russellville, which is like an hour away from Sutton Farm, was known as like the Klan hotspot of that area. Claverns from all over the county would gather there. And whether or not the Langford Suttons were connected to it, we can't know, we can't assume. But this does speak a lot about like the cultural and political environment, specifically that of tobacco farmers, specifically in that area. And so in 1950s, we know that Wesley Swift was tight with Gerald Smith, and Smith, who was instrumental in bringing together like a lot major elements of the Third Klan, also brought Swift all over the country, specifically to spread identity doctrine to Klansmen. And I don't know if he went to the Hopkinsville, Kelly Station, Russellville or not, but I will say that a Pentecostal church in the heart of like tobacco farmers who one generation ago were all riding around in hoods lynching black people probably would have been a good place to be. And even if he didn't go, this is still a very compatible place to sort of have someone be interested in Christian identity tracts. So the aftermath of all of this is that the Kelly incident is extremely influential in American culture. Langford's tale of the little silver men mixed with contemporaneous tales from Eastern Kentucky about a tall green guy, and these things together became the Little Green Men. So the phrase "little green men" comes from this. And also like the shape of the aliens, the rainbow shooting UFO, all of this you saw in
typical
E.T.
imagery.
Well, it's E.T. I mean, this is where Spielberg got his inspiration for many elements in E.T.
So E.T. phoned Richard Butler or Wesley Swift or something?
E.T.
Phone Wesley.
Yes. As for UFO studies, of course, there's always debates on every case, which is why UFO studies are really fun and cool to read. And you learn lots of interesting things because everybody's always like, you know, they're approaching it critically, usually. But generally, there is a very positive feeling around the story. At worst, it's seen as like, a hoax, but a hoax that we can kind of deal with culturally because it's sort of like also cute Americana. Isabel Davis's resentment towards Major Albert's account, you can still feel today when people talk about the case. But from where I'm sitting, I mean, the fact that unless Albert knew quite a lot about this developing Christian identity thing, enough to like falsify a real existing tract from Fort Worth, Texas, where he was not from, unless he did that and for some reason like planted this evidence in order to delegitimize the story, I think it's, you know, it's safe to say that like, yeah, farmers, a family of tobacco farmers in the middle of Klan country, in the place where tobacco farmers had a history of lynching blacks. It seems rational to me to assume that there is a Christian identity.
Or it's not unreasonable that
point of origin here. Yeah.
That somebody would have a Christian identity tract in that place and time.
And the fact that tract had a picture of a silver monkey, which really resembles the aliens that they saw. I think, I don't know. To me, it seems pretty clean.
Where did Christian Identity get that image from? I mean, how did they design that alien?
Oh, I don't know. No, I don't know. From what Albert describes it as a monkey painted silver. That's all.
Uh-huh.
That's all he says about it. So I don't know. That's the Kelly incident. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I'd never heard of the Christian Identity connection there. It seems.
Yeah, no one has, by the way. This is hot TENE, hot takes from TENEPod.
But that is featured in the original report then. I mean, that this tract existed.
Yeah, but not that he was Christian Identity, nor that he was British Israelist, just that this was the tract, this was the name, this was the publisher, this is the guy that wrote it. That's it.
And the publisher is a Christian Identity publisher from Fort Worth, Texas.
Yeah.
Seems like a notable omission.
Yeah, I'd say so. And of course, if you do hear the story somewhere, you're really not going to hear any of this. I mean, one thing, a big blind spot that I would like to talk about again in a little while, but one of the big blind spots I see for ufology is exactly like the socio-political circumstances around these events. Like they're happy to look at state level conspiracies, but seem to have very little patience for, let's say, like the anthropological conditions in which these things occur, you know?
Right.
So yeah, or historical developments of like what kinds of politics run parallel to ufology and how these politics might intervene inside ufology. And that seems to be a big blind spot. Which takes us to F-file number 2, our last F-file for today.
F-file number 02, the Lovette-Cunningham Incident, 1956.
The Grudge 13 report, and also anal coring. Yeah.
Coring
like of an anus.
Like coring an apple? Kind of?
Like coring an apple if the core of the apple was a butthole. Yes.
Okay.
All right. So supposedly occurring like...
Wait, is this the origin story of like the alien anal probe or whatever?
Ooh, this is no, it's not the probe. This is a straight up mutilation. This is a cattle mutilation story imposed onto humans.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a very famous story, and I would say it's like increasingly famous, and the reasons for that are very interesting. So this is our final tale of the evening here. So now this, like the Kelly Goblins, this Grudge 13 thing is a very popular story. You'll see it all over the fucking place, especially on YouTube, but I mean really everywhere. Pretty much everyone who covers it uses the same book to tell this tale, a little number called Military Encounters with Extraterrestrials that helped to repopularize it in recent years. And since I don't want to really break with that tradition, I think we should probably hear the story the way everybody else does.
In March 1956, Air Force Sergeant Jonathan P. Lovett assisted Major William Cunningham of the United States Air Force Missile Command near Holloman Air Force Base in White Sands, New Mexico, in scouring the silent desert with flashlights for scattered debris from a recent rocket test. As their search carried them away from the launch site, the two men wandered somewhat apart, and Sergeant Lovett temporarily disappeared over the ridge of a small sand dune. Around 3 a.m., the Major was shocked to hear a loud scream in extreme fright or pain. He assumed that Lovett had been bitten by a poisonous snake and sprinted over the sand dune to help him. Instead, Cunningham saw a long, serpentine arm wrapped around the terrified sergeant's legs as it inexorably dragged him towards a silver disc hovering in the air 15 to 20 feet away. The Major froze in horror, staring dumbfounded as the hopelessly struggling Lovett was dragged inside the craft, which immediately thereafter rose vertically and speedily, without a sound, into the starry night sky. Cunningham stumbled towards the jeep that had carried them out into the desert and radioed missile control for assistance.
So, a security team arrives and hurries this traumatized Cunningham off for observation and treatment, and they begin their search of the area. And they find nothing. Missile Control notes that they saw a blip on the radar around 3 a.m. when this happened. And 3 days later, and 10 miles away, they find Lovett's corpse, finally. Medical examiners note that this corpse appears to have been exposed to the elements for only 2 days out of the 3 days he was missing, leaving 1 day unaccounted for. So, but that's actually honestly kind of burying the lead here. As the initial publisher of this tale, or teller of this tale, Bill English, would say, this man's anus had been cored. Also, his tongue was removed from the lower jaw, his eyeballs gouged out, his cock and balls neatly unplugged, and despite having no signs of vascular collapse, the sergeant had been completely drained of blood. Cunningham is initially suspected.
He was exsanguinated.
Exsanguinated, that's right.
Yeah.
Cunningham, but the blood vessels didn't collapse as they should, so that's crazy.
Right.
You know? Cunningham is, of course, the initial suspect, but the medical examiners quickly rule all this out because, like, all these mutilations were made with what they call surgical precision, but also with a technology that they have never seen before. Moreover, the body itself was poisonous, and several dead birds were found, cadaver-eating birds were found around the corpse of Lovett. So now, before we talk about Bill English, the guy who first publicized the story, I think I would like to take a moment now to offer a very bad omen, though, for this story of ours. The book that Boris read from here was written by a fella named Frank Joseph, but we on the Empire Never Ended know him by a different name, and that is Frank Collin. Now, we actually mentioned Frank, I think, way back in our James Mason episodes, I think, even before the A&P episodes we did. But yeah, he was the Midwest coordinator in Chicago for the American Nazi Party in the 1960s, was also apparently for a time a favorite to replace Rockwell, but everybody was apparently then. And in 1970, it came out that Frank's dad was a Jewish artist, and so they tossed him out of the A&P. You would guess that maybe he headed over to like the National Renaissance Party, you know, because they're cool with that kind of stuff there. But
everybody.
Yeah. But no, he decides to strike out on his own and forms the National Socialist Party of America and makes a name for himself kind of nationally, thanks, I mean, in part to the ACLU, who defended his right to march through Skokie, Illinois, made a bunch of press and stuff like that. Like most Nazis, Collin's ultimate downfall was, of course, do you want to guess?
Pedophilia?
Yes, indeed. And his conviction for molesting little boys brought none other than Harold Covington into power, who himself turned Collin into the police. Collin was sentenced to 7 years in 1979, serving only 3. And when he got out, he began to use his middle name, Joseph, in place of his last name, and kind of reinvented himself as a popular author of about shit like paganism, New Age, spirituality, and most importantly, though, for the time, Atlantis. His first book about Atlantis was published in 1987, and this pushed him into a whole new world of like gullible but pleasant people that he would go on to exploit for decades. So he's still alive today. He's 77 years old. And in that time, he became an expert in the field of alien mysteries and the idea that Earth is currently waging a secret war against alien invaders, which is how we got this story. So
that was also in the X-Files, right?
Mm-hmm,
You had the shape-shifting alien assassins that were... Yeah.
You know what? Yeah, the stuff that he draws from, though, is like stories from the Korean War, a lot from the 1950s, blah, blah, blah. It's more conventional warfare. At least as far as I saw. I mean, I'm sure he does get into shapeshifters as well, but from what I read, it was fairly conventional stuff. But yeah, and this is not an old book, by the way. This was published on September 11th in 2018, so this is a recent book. The Cunningham Lovett incident, as I mentioned already, supposedly happened back in 1956. The first time I heard about it was about a year ago, as I was like looking through just other crazy dumb Nazi shit on the History Channel. This thing kind of popped up. And something about it like screamed Nazi bullshit somehow. I don't know how, but there's something in there that sent up a red flag. So that's why this episode exists, actually, is because of this incident.
I was wondering, actually, how you can guess
that. So we're going to have to leave Frank, though, aside for another episode someday, because it's not really about Frank. But for that matter, it's also not about Cunningham or Lovett, because neither of these people existed, and this never really happened. This is a story about two guys named Bill. And the first telling of the story comes from Bill English, who I said he claims to be he claims to have been assigned to analyze a file called Grudge 13, which is where this tale comes from, while stationed at the RAF Air Base in Chicksands, England in 1977. So I just want to add here, just give a shout out to a really well done podcast called The Saucer Life, which was really helpful in this part of the episode especially. They have more of like a mainstream in the sense of like the UFO community narrative about these things. I can definitely recommend it. The host is very professional. It's a very good show. But he also has the same kind of political blind spot that a lot of this community has, specifically about like the varieties of fascism in America. And yeah. So anyway, Bill English is given this file, supposedly, Grudge 13, and told to analyze its veracity. So Bill English says he was deeply impressed by this report and would later claim that it reminded him of similar things that he had seen while serving as a Green Beret in Vietnam. He saw like a crashed airplane with like a bunch of people's eyes gouged out, missing genitalia, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, Bill's military history is pretty suspicious. Not necessarily the point of this episode, but just to mention that Frank Collins' telling of Bill English's story is this. English is a former Green Beret in the U.S. Army 8th Special Forces Group. Following his Southeast Asian tour of duty in 1977, he was assigned to U.S. Security Services Command Headquarters at the RAF base in Chicksands, England. This is Bill English's also telling. Now, in real life, the 8th Special Forces Group of the Green Berets was deactivated in 1972. He finished in 1977. So unless English holds like the secret title of like the longest tour of duty in NAM history, this is a verifiable lie.
Well, also the Vietnam War was over, but after that 1977.
Yes.
By 1977.
But this is, yeah, he says he finished his tour of duty in 77 and went to Chicksands. So a lot of big holes here, not very believable in many ways. You'll see that Bill English is an accomplished fantasist as well. So English claims that when he presented his report to his superiors about Grudge 13, supporting the veracity of these documents, he was promptly fired from his position, deported back to the U.S. as like an undesirable, and forced to leave his wife and kids without any notice whatsoever, and with no contact forever, who never saw him again and heard from him like once, like 4 years later. Bill claims that this was not his choice, but somehow the Air Force's machinations. So he also claims that multiple very dramatic attempts have been made on his life by the U.S. government, including thousands of rounds of machine gun fire shot into his suburban home. He says that he'd been blown up. He says he survived poisonings, missile attacks, and other like completely fake nonsense. Finally, hiding out first in what he describes as a gay sanctuary, believing no one would find him there, and I guess figuring himself out a little bit. Ending up finally at his mother's ranch where no one would ever think to look for him. Again, thanks to the Saucer Life for that little bit there. He became a celebrity in the UFO community in 1980s, and a few years into his new career, a ufologist by the name of Bill Cooper, another Bill, this is our second Bill, published his own account of Grudge 13, claiming that he too was asked to analyze it when he was supposedly working for naval intelligence back in 72. I haven't confirmed whether or not he did work for naval intelligence. Maybe somebody can help us out there. Cooper, like English, was also being constantly hunted by the world's most inept death squads. He lost a leg in an attempted hit while he was riding his motorcycle, and some assassins in a truck tried to like run him over.
Or he was drunk and...
As his brother describes the event, Cooper was driving way too fast and smashed into a truck. So, you pick which story you like better. So in 1989, English writes to Cooper expressing his admiration for Cooper's work on Grudge 13. Again, remember, Cooper claims to have read it about 3 or 4 years before English read it, even though Cooper gives his account after English gives his account. So English writes to Cooper, proposes like a joint lecture tour on Grudge 13 in the future. So what is Grudge 13? Well, okay. So Project Grudge was the name given to the Air Force's attempt initially in the late 40s to respond to UFO sightings and fears about UFOs, but also to investigate the possibility that the Soviets actually had this kind of shit. Grudge was renamed Project Sign at the end of the 40s, and then again renamed once more in the 50s to what probably more people know as Project Blue Book. There's something like 13,000 to 14,000 files in Project Blue Book. They're all unsealed now. Grudge 13, however, is a completely different thing. Project Grudge, in reality, ended in like 48, 49, but Frank Collins argues that the program continued well into the 1960s in secret. And the story that you'll probably hear if you go down YouTube rabbit holes about Grudge reports is that Grudge files 1 through 12 and 14 had all been declassified, but Grudge 13 remains closed to this day. Now, as far as I know, there's never been a Grudge 14 either. These reports tap out at 12. It's the same with Sign that came after. So I think the whole Grudge 14 story is there to make Grudge 13 look plausible. So whatever. So the Kelly Goblins are also supposedly covered in Project Blue Book, but I haven't been able to find it, and I don't know. So Bill English, was an attention seeker. He was a fantasist, and he lost credibility in the UFO community like almost from the get-go with this thing called the Cash Landrum Incident in 81, where he was an on-scene investigator for APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, and went ahead, instead of bringing that data to APRO, sold it immediately to the Weekly World News tabloid and made some cash on it. So APRO booted him, and there was a bit of a scandal here. So by the late 1980s, however, these little details about Grudge 13 and English's supposed military and intelligence backgrounds were like candy to the UFO hunters, and he manages to salvage his career on this story from the gutter for a little while anyway. Cooper himself was instrumental in this because his late contribution to the Grudge 13 story bolstered English's credibility at the time when it was seriously waning. There is, I should say, a theory by oh my God, Ray, you just mentioned his name earlier.
Jacques Vallée.
Yes, Jacques Vallée. That he says he doesn't doubt he doesn't doubt the intentions of these two bills, which he really should, but he gives a plausible explanation for Grudge 13, and that is that Grudge 13 may have been a test, essentially, for weeding out idiots from their intelligence services. And it would make sense that Bill English failed this test, and that's why he was fired from RAF Chick Sands, And then later, it would make sense that Cooper, if he was even there to begin with, if he was there, that's a pretty decent explanation for Grudge 13. It's just it's a test to see how fucking gullible you are, and he failed. If that's true. So this relationship that the two Bills had at this point, remember, they have the same story, they're bolstering each other's credibility. They kind of need each other, honestly, but this relationship very quickly sours. They both begin to claim that the other one was a fraud. They're both completely right about this. And Bill wrote his most famous book at this time, Bill Cooper, called Behold a Pale Horse in 1991.
Oh, I know this.
Yeah, it's a big book in the kind of conspiracy world.
Yeah.
It doesn't deal directly with Lovette-Cunningham, but he does talk about the Grudge reports. Cooper has a very bad handle on the history of Blue Book. He mixes up when the Sign project happened, when the Grudge project happened, in order, I think, to create more plausibility about the idea that Grudge continued when it didn't. He claims, for instance, that there are actually 16 volumes of Grudge because he has to have these secret ones that continued forever. He also claims that the CIA were formed specifically to deal with the alien threat. And I guess if he means aliens in the sense that Father Coughlin means aliens, then maybe. But he was also tight with John Lear, the son of the inventor of the Learjet, apparently himself a former CIA pilot and UFO conspiracist who also lost credibility later on, as well as Bob Lazar. If you grew up in the States, in the late 90s, 2000s, and you had Coast to Coast AM, you know about Bob Lazar. He was the guy that said he worked at Area 51 and gave us a lot of this stuff. He's a Joe Rogan guest, even now, He got arrested, incidentally, for running a prostitution ring in the 1990s. He's that kind of guy. So an interesting side
adults,
note,
right? Not children.
Yeah, adult. Yeah. So, that's our bar here at the show. So an interesting side note, though, I mentioned APRO already, but the other major civilian UFO research institution, it lasted for a while, a couple decades at least, maybe 3, was NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. NICAP's well known, I would say. Yeah.
I was on their emailing list for a while. Then MUFON, Newfork. I liked reading their reports. It's a lot of fun.
Oh, it's great. Yeah. APRO formed in 52 and NICAP formed in 56. APRO eventually kind of dissolved and became MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. So interestingly, just on the CIA thing and CIA and the UFOs, one of the first directors of NICAP's board was a guy named Roscoe H. Hillenkotter. And those among our listeners who are more interested in intelligence and covert ops and stuff probably know him as the first director of the CIA and the guy ultimately in charge of Gladio, overseeing James Jesus Angleton. He didn't last very long there, despite like opening the door for CIA covert ops, because he failed to predict the Korean War. So we're not going to talk much about him today, but maybe it'd be cool to come back to. But there is like a Gladio NICAP connection. So back to Cooper and English. As I mentioned, they were feuding publicly, and as a result, essentially blew up each other's spots, right? They like delegitimized each other, mutual destruction in the UFO community. And the UFO community did the smart thing, and they dumped both of them, finally. In fact, it seems like Cooper's relationship to John Lear, the CIA pilot, was also part of his downfall following some like UFO community scam of Lear's that implicated Cooper. I don't know enough to talk about it, but that Saucer Life podcast has a thing on it. It's pretty good. So both Cooper and English seemed at this point to drop the whole alien thing altogether. So what do two ex-military hucksters and conspiracists do with themselves in the early 90s if they're not making money off of like gullible skywatchers? Well, they do the only thing that they can do. They come out publicly as frauds. They apologize to the people they hurt. They moved on with their lives, and they kept their heads down.
Oh, that's not where I was expecting that to go.
Yeah, that's because it didn't happen. What they did was they joined the militia movement.
Okay.
Yes. So Bill English became a sovereign citizen and joined the New Mexico Citizens Regulated Militia, a large parent organization that brought together smaller militias from across the state. Of course, despite claiming like not to be racist, these like all-white militia groups believed there was like a true constitution that was natural to the American people, suppressed by this like false constitution on top of it. By whom, you might ask? So that takes us to our actual second Christian identity reference of the day. And that is through Posse Comitatus, which was formed in 1980s on specifically identity principles. And taking it back even further, of course, we had Wesley Swift and his like best frenemy William Potter Gale, co-fathers of like kind of mature Christian identity. They were both early organizers in the militia movement in the early 60s, like on the heels of Depew and the Minutemen, who I think were the very late 50s, I believe, right?
Yeah.
So Posse Comitatus and the 90s militias, like Bill English's New Mexico Citizens Regulated Militia, participate in something called common law courts, which are these fake courts that produce fake court documents and conduct like fake court trials and stuff, which I guess would be kind of fine if they kept to themselves. But for whatever reason, they insist on having like state governments recognize their decisions. And so apparently in the 90s, like the state of Texas had like this massive backlog of like these common law court complaints that were being filed with the Texas state government. So back again now to the early 90s, we're looking at 1991 here. Cooper's hatred of English during their UFO community time together survived their move away from this community. And Cooper published this hilarious paper in his new role as the head of the Arizona Citizens Agency for Joint Intelligence, in which he claims that English is a New World Order infiltrator in the New Mexico militia and was doing the work of the CIA to promote UFOology, designed to further world government. Over time, however, Cooper focuses much less on that whole Grudge Report thing. He just sort of like backs off and instead starts to build an audience for his new shortwave radio show and his writings on his writings on the Oklahoma City bombing and other conspiracies like that. He's been referred to as the original Alex Jones, I've heard, for as far as shortwave radio goes. So about this Arizona Citizens Agency for Joint Intelligence. So now this was let's call it a department of the hot new militia, the Second Continental Army of the Republic in Arizona. And from what I can tell, the intelligence agency was literally just Bill Cooper, and the Second Continental Army of the Republic, or SCAR, which is, come on, nailed it.
That's pretty good.
Nailed it. Was also probably just Bill Cooper and maybe a few cops or something like that. That's kind of what it looks like. So Cooper and SCAR are going to wrap up this episode for us. From the FOIA requests that you can find on archive.org, we see that the FBI first took an interest in Cooper like back in like 95, I think. So it turns out that Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, was not only a fan of William Pierce, of course. Tim adored Cooper's radio show and his books, and he and one of his later accomplices in the bombing, Michael Fortier, visited Cooper in November of 94 and supposedly asked Cooper to join them. Cooper claims that he refused. He says he denounces violence, blah, blah, blah. And before Tim and Mike drove off, Tim went to the car, to pull out a copy of the Turner Diaries, which he tried to gift to Bill Cooper. Bill accepted it, but also mentioned that he already had his own copy. When the FBI asked him about this, Bill straight up denied that it was Timothy McVeigh at all, only admitting this in 98 when our story comes to a dramatic conclusion. So, among other things, Cooper obviously was a tax evader, and finally this would be his undoing, as it often is with these guys. In November of 1998, the FBI sends a dude to go interview him at his compound in Eagar, Arizona. That's Eagar, which is a small city with a very accommodating, as far as, militias are concerned, a very accommodating local police department. So there are some handwritten notes from this FBI visit to Cooper, and way up at the top is one that says, quote, "He'd rather his children be dead." That's like one of the first notes. Bill had 2 daughters in this compound. It's a house. Compound's more fun. I'm just gonna call it it's not a compound, but it's a house. Okay. So he had 2 daughters with this Taiwanese wife who Bill claims taught their children anti-communist principles. This, by the way, would be his 8th wife. Most, if not all of them, by the way, were Asian. Cooper, it seems, had sexually assaulted his last wife in a really brutal and humiliating way, and had a reputation in general for domestic violence and possibly even child abuse, both sexual and otherwise, although I can't verify that. That's where we are now. This is where this story takes us. So earlier that year, Cooper had claimed that the ADL and the federal government were trying to exterminate him to bring in the Illuminati's socialist totalitarian New World Order. So the motorcycle accident I mentioned earlier, that was part of this. And because of that accident, Cooper hobbled around with a wooden leg, making him even more like fucking insane to behold, as like a spectacle. So the visiting agent also noted that Cooper believed he was appointed by God to deliver America from evil. He owned a 50 caliber sniper rifle, among other things in the house, other weapons, and a very angry pit bull named Crusher, who was chained to the front of the house. And it seemed that Cooper was also engaged in some kind of a weird relationship, probably a hustle, with local Mormons who apparently really, really liked him. And from the FBI reports, it looks like one of his like LDS followers who seemed to believe that Cooper himself was Mormon, maybe, tried to convince the liberal female mayor at the time, whose name was Burke, to go visit Cooper as shit was getting real with the FBI there, essentially trying to get her to go and be a hostage for Cooper, And I'll explain what I mean by this now, like why a hostage might have been helpful. So, like I said, there was an FBI agent at his house in November of 98. And after this, Cooper went on this full media offensive, declaring that the New World Order was out to get him, that he'd never pay his fucking taxes, and he would shoot the next agent that came over. But there was a federal agent that came over, not having been informed about this proclamation. Cooper put a gun to his head, told him to fuck off, and the guy did. And this is something that Cooper will do a lot. So this begins this 3-year standoff with the FBI and the IRS. The local government and the sheriff both warn the FBI that they don't want like a Waco or Ruby Ridge on their hands. And the feds are like, yeah, no shit. Like we don't either. So the FBI decides to hang back and run like a long-term surveillance program, which was probably pretty nice for the old pocketbook too, and figure out what to do next. So meanwhile, Cooper is there still running his radio show, selling copies of his newest book on the OKC bombing, which he claims is a false flag operation by the FBI. So during the course of this investigation, police links with Cooper are uncovered, but nothing was done about them, and Cooper is seen multiple times in downtown Eagar shopping. Cooper's wife and kids like bug the fuck out pretty early on, although on his radio show, Cooper pretends they still live with him. And when this lie is exposed, he then claims that he himself sent them away for their own safety so as not to use them for a human shield, which is funny because there's another note from the FBI that says earlier in the 90s, Cooper attacked and yelled racial slurs at a black cop and then literally hid behind his wife and children to avoid retaliation. So Annie Cooper, his latest wife, goes right ahead and tells the feds what she knows when they catch up to her in California in 99. So also in 99, Bill's running a scam where he's convincing his fans to pay him to put their money and gold in an offshore account that he's keeping safe somewhere from the federal government. He charges 10% on all these transactions, and the website itself is called Offshore Secrets. He also regularly threatened to stop broadcasting his show if his listeners didn't double their contributions to him. So as the standoff wears on, Cooper claims that Bill Clinton is out there calling him the most dangerous radio host in America. And through his press, Harvest Trust, and his paper called Veritas, Bill writes of the feds.
These people are morally bankrupt and, in fact, are Nazi jackbooted thugs of the worst SS Hitler stormtrooper type. They have no ethics, morals, or respect for life, property, religion, or the law. The Nazis were socialists, and socialists are Nazis. Socialists are in complete control of the government of the United States of America today.
Yeah, it's a Nazi calling the kettle a Nazi, I would say.
Now I want everyone out there to listen very carefully to what I have to say, because I am sick to death of having the Holocaust thrown in my face.
But, socialist, Nazis, Nazi, socialist thing, you get it.
No, he's just racist. He's not a Nazi. Okay?
Yes, exactly right. Exactly. He also vaguely threatens Bo Gritz, who was the right-wing media personality, like ex-military, occasional politician, who was the guy who talked down the surviving Weavers in Ruby Ridge. So he kind of like lost cred in this, neo-fascist militia community for this. And so Cooper says, please send Bo Gritz. I would love to see him like coming up the hill through my crosshairs and some shit like that. All right. So Bill Cooper.
He likes threatening shooting people a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Seems to have not stacked up the amount of bodies that you would expect.
Yeah. He does grab himself one, but that's how we're going to end this. So Bill Cooper himself had a nice little spot there, right? In Eagar, Arizona. So at the base of his property is a cul-de-sac that offered this beautiful, perfect spot to watch the sunset, And several times during the standoff, poor, like, normal people would drive to this cul-de-sac to enjoy the sunset with their families or their partners. And like fucking clockwork, Bill would hobble into one of his 4 to 6 trucks that he owned and drove down to meet them. And when they would inevitably like greet Bill, like, hey, buddy, just enjoying the sunset, Bill would fucking pull a gun out, press it to their fucking head, and then tell them to like get the fuck off his property. And this happened so often and so regularly that finally the county sheriff's department had an idea in November of 2001, right? So I guess they were tired of waiting for the FBI to make a move. Like September 11th had happened, and I don't know if there was some sense of urgency from this. I have no idea. But the sheriff's department decided to do what the FBI wasn't doing. So they make a move, and in November of 2001, the Apache County Sheriff's Department sends a couple of deputies disguised as like a couple in love, and packs 4 SWAT team members into the bed of the truck and then covers the bed. And then also a van full of SWAT team members and other deputies is like lingering on the other side of the hill, just out of sight, ready to move, So as expected, Bill Cooper sees the couple there enjoying the sunset, drags his pirate ass into his truck, and then goes down to threaten them, as you do.
To do a Gran Torino get off my lawn thing,
well, yes.
Coupled with the same amount of racial slurs in that movie.
Yeah, plus a wooden leg, which to me is just the cherry on the cake here. This time he doesn't get out of his car. He instead waves his gun around at the undercover deputies in the cab of the truck, does his usual shtick, and at this point, the SWAT team members reveal themselves, but Cooper books it back up the hill, right? But as he gets out of his car at his house, he's met there by another deputy whom Bill shoots twice in the head. The deputy, I think, actually survives this, interestingly. Unfortunately for Bill, there was another deputy behind that deputy, and that deputy put 9 bullets into Bill, who died on the spot. No one from the militia movement came to his funeral. Yeah. So that's the end of Cooper. I don't know about English. I think he's still out there. Frank Collin definitely is still out there. So that's the quite famous story of Grudge Report 13. Although usually all that militia stuff is mentioned, but not really opened up, and certainly not tied to the same kind of Christian identity thing that seems to me to have been very influential in the 50s as far as UFO stories goes, at least in these 2 cases. But again, I would call these like alternate hypotheses that I think are plausible and should be considered. So later we'll get to stuff like Adamski and Mice and Serrano and Thule and Vril and like Zundel and Mason, and we'll get back to Pelly. There's a lot of places to take this, and hopefully we can take a stab at the Gladio connection a little more, see if there's anything there. But that's all I wanted to say. So.